Hi, I am Brooke Grove. My NDE was a coma caused by systemic organ failure of the lungs, kidneys, and liver. In December of 2010, I slipped into a coma after a long-standing series of misdiagnoses of autoimmune disease. I had been ill for approximately 7 years at this point. They understood it to be related to the pulmonary system, and the kidneys had recently become involved. What no one understood at that time was that the liver was severely compromised. And so when this flare-up occurred, as I was awaiting a second opinion from Johns Hopkins, which at the time was the leading autoimmune research center in the world, I called my doctors and asked for their assistance, as I was already in Maryland waiting to go to treatment at Hopkins. And they instructed me in unison, and this is a multidisciplinary team, a rheumatologist, a pain management doctor, let's see who else, a neurologist, and let's see, anyone else included? There were quite a few. The kidney doctor as well, and they all said take the medication. The medication's the best you can do. Wait, Hopkins will help you, just be patient, get in bed. And that's exactly what I did. And that's the last of my memory until I go into my NDE. Everything else that I know and will share with you today is per family memory and also my medical records, which confirm this. So I took the medication, and what ended up happening, because we didn't understand that the liver was involved, was that this medication, which would have been benign to somebody that didn't have liver failure, had traces of Tylenol in multiple products. Now, it's not enough Tylenol that would harm a healthy person, but to someone whose liver was compromised, it created an overdose of Tylenol. And when that Tylenol took out the liver literally failed upon taking the medication. It then took the kidneys and the lungs because they were so compromised. So in a matter of moments, I went from being conscious to nearly unconscious. I was, by the grace of spirit, my family walked in, they had been traveling, and they got home just in the nick of time, found me on the bed face down. I had swelled up about 20 pounds just since I took the medication. When the liver fails that rapidly, you just release everything from the liver through the skin, so the bile, everything from the liver comes out. You swell up, you inflame very badly, you turn purple from head to toe, so it looked like I was badly bruised, and I was completely yellow, yellow eyes, yellow. The closest thing I can compare it to from the photos I saw and how I woke up later was looking like a mutant of some form. And so my family naturally is terrified. They think I'm already dead because I'm face down and they can't hear me breathing, and they can't even see it. That's how bad the lungs have been compromised. And so they immediately call 911, and I'm rushed to the local hospital. The local hospital quickly realizes they do not have the support that I need, so I'm helicoptered at this point to Johns Hopkins. During the helicopter ride, at some point I came to, and I was screaming in horrific pain from the just agony of it all. Well, they wanted to help. In a benevolent attempt to help the pain, they gave me morphine, which was the last straw. My liver literally could not take that, and I just went out. So by the time I get to ICU, which is where my near-death experience begins, I'm completely unconscious and fully comatose. So in ICU, I begin to float out of the body. And as I'm going upward, I've been an avid lucid dreamer my entire life. So there was this part of my consciousness, which is all I was at this point, that was looking at the situation and feeling, oh, I'm in a lucid dream. How interesting. Why are they all wearing hazmat suits? Why do they all have, all this protective gear on? Very interesting dream. I don't like this dream. It's not really comfortable. I'm going to get out. And so I'm actively attempting to wake myself up. And then I realized that the body on the table, though disfigured and discolored and swollen, is me. And as I become curious about this, because again, I'm this orb of consciousness, and yet I very much in my personality, I'm still feeling and thinking as I would as a human. So it hasn't hit me yet that I'm not embodied and that this is not a dream. And so as I'm having all these curiosities and questions, suddenly I'm catapulted up, 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 up until I'm not in the hospital anymore. I'm not even concerned about that human body. Suddenly I'm in the most beautiful, ineffable place. And the best description in human language is that it was like the cosmos. Take a picture of NASA and amplify it to the highest saturation. And that's what it was like. There was so much light, so many star-like orbs. The difference being that when you see a still photo of space, it's still. In this space, the light was actually pulsating constantly, in and out, in and out, in and out. There was a signature to it through which it communicated. It did so without talking, without saying a word, just that light itself, the pulsation, would allow for an inner knowing. And so I realized very quickly that 3 of these light beings that were to my right side had been lights that I had seen as a child. And so they felt very comfortable to me and beckoned me. And so I went closer to them. Now when I say I went, I too am nothing but an orb of light in this space. I don't have form, but I have what feels like color because there's like a pulsation around me as well. It's different than the vibration that they're emanating, yet it was my consciousness as it appeared in this space, free from all other form, could move very, very quickly. And so it was almost as if there was form yet formlessness co-occurring. And so I became very curious about these 3 beautiful jewel-toned lights. And as I had my curiosity about them, they began to communicate to me through telepathy. And I asked them if I had known them, and they said yes. And I said, "You've been with me all along." And they said yes. And I said, "I knew you in childhood." And they said, "You've known us in many childhoods." And I felt held and comforted and just so loved. My background as a human, which is relevant to why this feeling of being held was so overwhelming and so precious and so beautiful and so beyond any language I can provide, is that I am and was a polytrauma survivor. And so as a child, I never really had that experience because my story had been shamed and invalidated and said that it wasn't true, etc., because the family system was just too deep in denial and didn't want to deal with what it would mean if my story were true. And so because of that, the abuse went on for 5 to 7 years. And I had a really difficult time as a teenager, and it didn't stop until I left and came to California. And so being in this space where these beings that I had interacted with as a child and also had been told they weren't real, suddenly they're there and they're holding me and they're letting me know everything is going to be okay. And I did not want to leave that feeling of unconditional love, of being seen, of being received. It's the way that you hope that all new babies enter this world in their mother's arms. You hope that all persons begin life being held with that kind of love, that kind of devotion. And in it, there was no concern or judgment for the things I had done when I was in survival mode. Being a polytrauma survivor at such a young age, we do often things to eradicate the pain. And so I had spent 5 to 7 years dissociating from my human body just to tolerate what was being done to it. And then when the dissociation failed to work, I self-medicated. I utilized drugs. I went down a dark road because I blamed myself for the abuse. My family couldn't acknowledge it even happened, and so it became, well then I'm bad. I'm a bad person. This wouldn't have happened if I hadn't been a bad child or if I hadn't called it in or something of that nature. Instead of allowing the maladaptive behavior to belong to who it belonged to, which was, of course, the abuser. And so in this space, there was this loving acknowledgement of you did what you had to do to survive. And that's okay, our precious child. That's okay. And I felt a peace I had not known, and especially since, early childhood. And I just wanted to stay with that peace. Yet, there was this other light that was so magnificent and so beckoning and so beyond words. It was much more of a pure, where they were jewel tones, and I call them my angelics. Other people might know them as call them light beings. I think the vernacular doesn't matter. What it was they were divine support teams. And they told me it was okay to be curious about anything in this space. It was my time to experience this space and make a choice. And I don't think the first time they said that to me that I even heard them, because I was so enchanted by the beauty and just the devotion the light had for me. It was as if I was being told, welcome home, in the most beautiful, artistic, nonverbal way. And so I began to be enchanted by this beautiful diamond-like light, and it's humongous. And for me, there was no tunnel or anything of that nature, because I'm in this free-floating, space-like place. There's darkness, but it's filled in spots with different shades of light and different light beings of all types. I did not see ancestors in human form, but I felt the presence of beloveds that had transitioned, and I had known that they were those that had shared lineage with me, or those that were there to support me. However, it was a felt experience. It wasn't them coming and saying it to me. It was just an intuitive knowing. And that love, likewise, was unconditional. And so as I began to travel towards this beautiful source light, this pure white light, the angelics came with me, and they allowed me to know that it's okay if you want to go back to that light. That light is where you're from. That light, you're a part of it. And their term for it is that you, humankind, are all fractals of source. You're all part of this light. This light's always been with you. This light has been inside of you. You can return to it, or you can choose to come back and you can finish the work you have to do in this incarnation. And for someone who had never felt such love and forgiveness, and forgiveness is a poor choice of words, acknowledgement that nothing I had done was wrong was more the way that it felt. In the human being here and now, it feels like forgiveness, but it was just that everything was okay. Everything was always all right. And so I didn't want to go. Why would I want to go back to a body and to a life that had only really known suffering? Now, mind you, I was 29 when my coma occurred, and the trauma began when I was 12. And then it manifested as physical disease at 23. So the better part of my life up until this point had been suffering, and profound suffering, not minor, in any form. And so I really wanted to go into the source light. And at the same time that I'm contemplating that, they say in the most beautiful way of inner knowing, that is, again, it's so hard to put these things in words. They tell me that I am welcome to stay. However, my soul came here, my oversoul, for a mission that was quite significant, and it was in alignment with the mission of many, many others who are incarnated on this earth at this time, and that we were a team, and that all of the suffering, all of the traumas, all of the things that we had been through were going to be what gave us the gifts and the opportunities to help Earth as she entered a time of great peril. And I didn't really understand what they meant by that at the time, yet my oversoul understood. And my oversoul wanted, in part, to come back, and my crown chakra is tingling as I acknowledge that. And so there was another series of lights that suddenly appeared in the space, and they were very different. They weren't vibrating at the same intensity as the angelics. They were not nearly as humongous or powerful as Source. Source had this magnetic power to it where it's like you felt like you were just being drawn to it. And yet there was this part of the oversoul and what the angelics were saying that were kind of like pulling, I'm like trying to pull back from this magnet. Now the magnet's not forcing me to come to it. It's just lovingly saying, I'm here, this is the way. And the angelics are also saying, hey, you also can disconnect from that gently if you'd like. And so I believe they gave me the gift of seeing these other lights so that I could make the choice for myself and free from just not wanting to go back to trauma, okay? Because one thing that they had said is while you will be of assistance to the earth and the collective at this time, and you will transmute and overcome all of these things, when you return, you will indulge in more suffering for a period of time. And that, of course, was terrifying. Even in the other side, you can feel fear. It's coming from the human, the karma, the ancestral that we still carry in part of our etheric chakras. So my consciousness was still had trepidation as I was held in this space, and they felt into that, and they said, my child, it's okay. You chose this, and you wouldn't have chose this if your soul hadn't already done so much work to be prepared for what you came in here for. And they were like, so you have the strength. You've always had the strength. You came to the door of Great Depression and suicide and all of these things, and they showed me all of the times I'd come so close to wanting to leave, and how every time I made the decision to stay, and how I had transmuted my pain by becoming a therapist and a healer and working with trauma survivors. And they just kept showing me very gently flashes of the ways that I had been strong even when I felt weak. And so in doing that, they gave me a lot of strength then and there. So I tuned into these other two lights, and one of which is the most beautiful indigo. It's still the most beautiful shade of indigo I've ever seen, and I have had the pleasure of seeing it again in this incarnation. And the other was this grassy, like pure emerald green, and they were these curiosities to me. They didn't speak like the other lights. And they had such a different vibration, yet there was something so intimately familiar about them. And so I became puzzled by them. I asked the angelics to allow me to talk to them, and they said they don't talk yet. And I'm like, what does this mean? But they didn't, like, you know, there was no further explanation. And so I just became really curious with them, and I noticed they were playful. They would like dart all over the place, and it's like they weren't communicating with inner knowing or words, but there was something about them that made me want to hold them. And so I was like, that's interesting. And in that moment when they appeared to me and I felt how playful they were, there was something in that very moment that said, go back to the body. And so I then asked Spirit or the angelics, how do I return? Because it seemed like I was in this other world. How do I get back? Is there a map? Is there a direction? And they spun me around super fast, and they said, look for the light unlike no other. Now, I've already seen 3 lights unlike no other, or 3 series of lights unlike any other, but they were quite correct. When my orb moved so quickly in the other direction, I saw this blinding artificial light, and they gently whispered, go into it. And at the speed of light, I was thrust into this artificial light. And next thing I know, I'm opening my eyes, and on the left eye, there is a neurological flashlight being shown into my eye. At this point, the hospital had believed that because of the minimal brain activity that was being shown on the monitors and my glass scale score, which is how they score comas, mine was so incredibly low, and then the systemic organ failure and the severity of the liver. My liver count was approximately 250,000. Most people die when you go over 100,000. So the fact that I was even surviving at that point was shocking to them, but they had prepared my family for the worst. They had said, you know, she's breathing through an intubator. Technically, she's brain dead according to what's going on in those two scales. And with the organ damage, should she wake up, she'll be a vegetable. So my family had been encouraged to prepare for the worst. They had already met with the social worker, the priest, you know, they were preparing last rites, all of that. Suddenly I wake up. Now, I can't move. I am strapped down to the bed because I have a PICC line going into my brain. And the PICC line literally has to go in very delicately, and the slightest movement can pull it out. And with the level of damage that I had already incurred, that would have likely been it. So because of the PICC line sensitivity and the fact that I was having involuntary muscle spasms, excuse me, which would make that move, they had to strap me down, like fully restrain me. And so I wake up and I'm intubated, and I don't know how I got into this coma. I don't know what's happened to me. I can't speak immediately. I try to speak. I realize there's something, you know, in my mouth and there. I don't have contacts in, nor do I have glasses, and so I can't really see. But what I notice immediately is that even though I can't clearly see, there's like a layer over everything that I've never seen before. I now understand I was seeing the quantum field and the energetic field, but it was basically like, if you are familiar with Alex Gray, like his paintings and how there's just like all of this energy, if you turn that into like a cartoon and you animated it and it's moving constantly, that's what I was seeing. And it wasn't just on people. People had a higher variation of it, but even like the machines around me, it was hard to be close to them because they were electronic and they're giving off the same intense energy, and all of this stuff is around the machine. And I'm thinking, what drugs did they give me? I am having a psychedelic experience and I just woke up. And at the same time, I'm like, why won't anyone communicate with me? Like, I'm up, I'm alive, hello. The nurses keep coming back. I keep moving my left eye because it's all I could move. And nobody's noticing anything. So after about, I don't know how long, a few hours I would imagine, because it felt like days, but it was likely a few hours, I started really thinking to myself, how am I going to get their attention? Like, they need to know I'm awake. I need to know what happened to me. And so, having been a doctoral candidate in clinical psychology at the time, I thought to myself, well, what'll get their attention? Spike your vital signs. Actually indulge the panic you're feeling. Don't fight it. Don't resist it. Because I had been meditating and attempting to ground myself and keep myself calm, and it was allowing them to think I was still comatose. So I gave into the panic. I gave into the confusion of what I was seeing. I started, having shallow breaths through the intubator. Next thing you know, the vital signs do go off the charts, which calls in the whole team of nurses. And then one nurse realizes, I think she's trying to communicate. And she says to me, can you move anything? And that's when I started blinking the eye rapidly, the left eye. And she said, okay. She said, if you understand us, which was curious to me, that if you understand us. She says, if you understand us, then blink once for yes, twice for no. She's like, do you understand me? Yes. Opened my eye. She's like, do you know what happened to you? No, I do not know what happened to me. And then she tells me, you've been in a coma. You've been in a coma for approximately 3.5 days. Welcome back. And she kind of disappears. She said, welcome back, with a bit of a tone. And I was noticing that in addition to this layer of color and things, that people, what they were expressing in their nonverbal and verbal behavior, suddenly I was like hearing their thoughts at times, and that was terrifying, but it was also like, wait a minute, there's more to the story. There's something they're not telling me. Now, very quickly, because of my training as a therapist and a psychologist, I start to notice that I'm being treated as someone who has attempted their life. And I can't communicate because I'm intubated still. I remain intubated for 3 days after waking up. So I can't express what's going on with what I'm seeing. I can't ask if I've been given drugs. And I can't ask why everyone's treating me like this. And my family is overjoyed and they're so loving and sweet. And, you know, my dad, like, I still remember he came in and he was like, if it's you, show me your mad face. Because since I was a kid, I had this, like, little pout I would do. And so I did it even with the intubator in there. And he just was crying and so happy and touched. And yet, over the next 3 days, as I'm awaiting the intubator to be taken out, I noticed a shift within my family. I noticed that certain doctors are being not so kind. Their bedside manner was terrible. And one nurse actually had the goal to say to me, it's not fair people like you survive when you had tried to take your own life. And that's when I knew that my intuition and the thoughts that I believed I was hearing, and I now know I was hearing, were accurate. They believed that I had purposely taken too much Tylenol and overdosed. And so it was a suicide attempt. Now, being a trained clinician myself, the last thing you want to do to someone who's suicidal is shame and demean them. And yet, that's exactly what I was met with. And the irony being, I had suffered from suicidality half of my life because of the trauma I endured, and yet I'd never acted on it. So there was this very human part of me that was angry because it was like, I've just come from the most beautiful place. Well, then the brain comes in, and the brain tries to tell all sorts of stories to change the narrative. And the narrative is, oh, that was a dream, that's not real, you know, this is what you deserve, this is, you know, the story is never going to change with your family, you're the, you know, the black sheep, you're the bad apple, etc., etc. And maybe you did take too much Tylenol, you don't remember, you know. And then there's this other part of me that's like, no, really loudly, no, we're done with that. And I'd been very fortunate as I'd been working with a Taoist master on my own spirituality right before this occurred. And he had always described my guides to me and told me how beloved I was by the angelics. And he described them in vivid detail. And he had told me maybe 2 or 3 months prior that I was going to meet them. And I would get to choose if I stayed with them or if I came back. Now, that was very cryptic at the time, yet it makes complete sense now. So when I wasn't able to speak yet, I was given my phone, and I contacted him by email, and I wrote him and I said, listen, I don't even have the words for what happened to me when I was in this coma. I guess most people would say it's paranormal. It felt divinely spiritual. You know, I did not believe in God. I was agnostic, not a full-blown atheist, but Catholic school and the priest who had, you know, shamed me and denied the abuse as well when I disclosed had done a number on me. And so I was very anti-religion and all of that. And I said to him, I said, something happened. If it was real, I need confirmation because I'm in a really terrible situation right now and I'm fighting believing it was real, and yet it being real, I almost need it. I need that love. I need to feel that now because that will support me. And he then described in vivid detail the angelics that I met. And he said, you chose to come back. He's like, they told you it was going to be hard and you chose to come back. I knew you would. And I said, so what do I do with this? And he's like, well, you realize that you have these gifts that have come on. You're feeling that, right? And I'm like, of course I'm feeling this, you know. I can't talk to anyone about it, which might have been a blessing because had I opened my mouth when they thought I was suicidal and started talking about angels and, you know, spirit and source and these divine beings, then they probably would have labeled me psychotic instead of suicidal. And so he told me, he said, all you have to do is ask. They're still with you. He's like, the things you're seeing, he's like, the veil's no longer there for you. He's like, welcome to being a walker between worlds. You are now going to be able to be on earth and touch the heavens. That's your gift. And so he said, just ask them and they'll assist you. And he instructed me to start playing with my hands, which I had noticed very early on were emitting light, and I could change the color of light with my intention. And so he's like, call on the angelics, play with your hands, notice what else comes up in the hospital room. And then myself, having been trained as a clinical researcher, I was not, ambidextrous at the time, but I could now move my left arm. They had freed it up because they had cut out the PICC line. And so I asked for pen and paper, and at first they gave me like 1 or 2 pieces, and I'm like, notebook, you know? And so someone lovingly brought me a notebook. And in complete chicken scratch, I start documenting, just like I would if I was researching something clinically, everything I'm experiencing, from the auras to the energy to the doctor that walks in the room and tells me I have a 1% chance of survival, I need a new liver, and the whole time I can see all of the blackness in his chest and him thinking, damn, I need a cigarette. And I'm in there going, is this how the rest of my life's going to be? How am I going to deal with this? And then I'm also constantly checking my orientation, because in psychology, orientation is time, place, person, situation. If you are oriented to all 4, you are therein considered not psychotic. So it's like once an hour I was giving myself a mental status exam, and I kept passing. And eventually they send the social worker and the psychologist in to do a suicidal screening right after they've taken the intubator out. I can barely speak. You can't speak well for a week, but because they were starting to deduce something else might have occurred, they sent them in, and I immediately passed the test. And the psychologist immediately commented, you're not suicidal. In fact, it's quite the opposite. You seem like you were doing everything to live. And I was like, you know? And as soon as that doctor told everyone else, this isn't a suicide, something else like occurred, there was a shift in how many of the nurses treated me. Then there were interesting things that occurred, like a nurse came in the middle of the night and I said, hey Nick, and he was like, he looked at me like, and I was like, I know your name because I kept hearing it. Even on the other side, there were moments where I could hear what was occurring. And this happens with a lot of NDEs, where we actually have experiences where we can confirm what happened to us while we were under, or someone that may have been with us, or an energy. And so I remembered his energy and I knew his name. And it made him jump out of his scrubs when I first said it. And this was puzzling to me too, because I'm thinking, they just told me I was in a coma and I was totally unconscious, but in some levels it seems like I was conscious. So as a scientist, that's puzzling. Document that. You know, so I started terming it unconscious consciousness, because it's what it seemed to be. Like there was something that was dually occurring. And now, understanding the quantum field, I understand that I was able to be in both spaces. My consciousness was disconnected from the body, but it was also because of the way that the quantum works, that the timelines are all connected. And so the next unfoldment of the after effects, and I am a very I am a very significant case of after effects. A lot of NDEers get 1 or 2 that are heightened. I kind of got the whole gamut. And I do believe that in part is from being an intuitive child that suppressed the gifts, which is why I was able to see the angelics as a child and communicate and sometimes read adults' thoughts and stuff as well. And yet, growing up Catholic, those psychic type of gifts were very much invalidated and shamed. I'd also known the time of passing of grandparents before it happened, and I boldly announced that once to my mom, thinking it would bring her comfort, like knowing that the phone call was going to be that my grandfather had passed. I warned her very gently, it's going to be your Aunt Betty, and she's going to say that Grandpa has passed. And the look of horror in her eyes when I said that, and then the phone rang the very next second, I'll never forget that. And so after that, when I would get these intuitions or these knowings, I just wouldn't share them. And the more that I suppressed them, the more that I lost them, until I woke up from coma. Now in ICU, when you're very, very ill, you are in a room that is entirely glass. and they leave all the blinds open all the time because they never know when they're going to need to come rushing in, especially when they believe you have a 1% chance of survival. Now, I could not sleep. The pain was absolutely horrific. And as I spoke with the angelics, they encouraged me to work with the light I was receiving at night, because it's when you had the least interference from the staff. They would come in to check your vitals, but they weren't coming in as frequently as in the day. And because, of course, they're hoping you're sleeping. Now, I couldn't sleep, and they could give me nothing for pain because my liver had failed. So I couldn't even tolerate like the most benign thing like Benadryl to help me sleep. And so I wasn't able to sleep. I was horrified that my family, and I understand how schemas and narratives become part of a family story, because sometimes it's easier for them to carry that story on than face the truth of what's happened. Yet I was hurt that I hadn't been doing the things that they had accused me of for many, many years. I had already, stopped all of that when I left the abuse, moved cross country to get away from it, changed my whole lifestyle, became a therapist. So I hadn't been involved in like anything that would bring me self-harm, and yet that's the story they immediately wrote. So I was struggling with that on a human level, but whenever I would call in the angelics, I would receive like an instant healing, and they would hold me in that same love that they held me on the other side. And so I felt very at peace with that. And as the doctors continued to tell me that I was going to be in the hospital for an insanely long amount of time, that I was on a liver transplant list, and they were doing everything they could. Now that they realized it was medical error, suddenly I'm moving to the top of that list, and they want to get me a liver, because since it was not an overdose, and I was young, and the chances of my survival and having a long life if I get a liver, very high. So I'm waiting the liver. They're running tons of tests trying to figure out what went wrong, how did they miss the liver not being involved. At the same time, at night, I'm noticing when they yell code red or code blue, I can see pillars of light around my neighbors across the way. And if it's their time to transition and they choose to go, which is always the soul's choice, some stay here because they're just not ready, and they're hooked or anchored into something occurring on Earth. So I began to see these pillars of light surrounding my cohorts in ICU, and it would only be when there's a code red or code blue. It didn't happen all the time, but it was those that were ready to transition. And it was kind of like watching a movie in a way, because it's nothing I'd ever experienced in this lifetime. These beautiful pillars of light would come seemingly come through the ceiling all the way down to the ground, and it varied day to day or night to night. I'd guess it maybe happened twice a week when someone would pass, but there would be the arrival of all these other light beings, and they would surround the pillar. And then when the person transitioned, if they chose to, which everyone I witnessed did, then I would actually see what I now know is the soul body or the ghost body actually come out of the physical body and go into that pillar, being like held and kind of carried by these other beautiful light beings who I feel now are the benevolent ancestors and their angelic teams. And that that really blew my clinically oriented mindset wide open, because I realized this isn't going anywhere. This is really who I am now, and it doesn't fit with anything of who I was. I was very analytical. I was very, for lack of better terms, married to the sciences. I understood things in a materialistic sense. That's how you're trained as a scientist. And suddenly, none of that fit. And so it was a struggle. And so my NDE, the beauty, the magnificent, the power of it all, it really began to lead me in a different direction from that moment forward as I continued to heal myself. And I did heal myself. I defied all medical expectations. I was told I would be in that hospital for a year at different varying levels of care, and then in a rehabilitation hospital to learn to walk and all of that stuff again. And instead I was like, no, I'm gonna work with the teams, I'm gonna heal, and I'm gonna be out of here before Christmas because I cannot stand listening to any more Christmas music in ICU. And they only played Christmas movies too, so it was just too much. That said, the doctors were like, yeah, that's cute, that's really cute, you keep on with that. But I'd been very blessed. I had studied psychology and the biology of belief under Dr. Bruce Lipton. I knew how important it was to really believe in something and then choose to anchor into that despite what the rest of the world may be telling you. And I also knew I had the assistance of some surgeons that had a lot greater powers than the ones that were wearing white coats. And so I worked with the angelics, I worked with the hands of light, which I still didn't understand what was happening, but I had enough familiarity with energy medicine and had known enough practitioners to know that it was something along those lines that was occurring, yet it was amplified by the angelic vibrations. And so intuitively I would just work on the organs that were in peril. And before long I was able to sleep instead of being in horrific pain. The swelling and the purpleness and the jaundice started going away. The doctors came in shock and told me they were moving me out of ICU to a lower level of care. And as soon as they did that, it meant I wasn't being watched all the time. And so I was very blessed to have a friend that was an occupational therapist, and I was determined to start getting out of bed and using the restroom on my own. And they told me they weren't bringing someone in for months, and I was like, that's not happening, because that was part of why the pain had stayed. They weren't moving my body. And so I knew I needed to move the body, and I was going to get out of there fast. And so my friend, I told her, I said, you know me, we've been friends forever. You have the skill set, I have the determination. You can help me if you like, or I'm just gonna do it. She's like, oh, you blessed fool. I'll come in at night and we'll do this. And sure enough, she came in and she helped me gently begin moving the arms, the legs. Within a few days, I was able to get up and use the restroom. The doctors came in maybe a week later and saw me walking around the room and were like, how did this happen? What are you doing? I'm like, oh, I can walk up 3 stairs. They're like, you can go out in the hall and show us. And so I walked out into the hall and I went to the 3 stairs and I went up and down. And they were a little upset with the nursing staff that this had been occurring and no one had caught me, but they also did not know my level of determination. And so I very rapidly begin to heal. The lungs and the kidney heal much quicker. And the liver's taking its time, but it's making huge shifts. Imagine I've gone from 250,000, I'm now below 100,000. By the 3rd or 4th week, I'm nearing what's known as the optimal range. So almost all of those horrific numbers have shifted down. I was in the like hundreds or so. So they end up telling me, we don't know how this is possible, but you have defied our prognosis. You still have a very long road as far as you need a transplant. But if your liver would stay like this, perhaps not, but in all probability this is some sort of fluke because it's just too hard for them to imagine. And so they're like, you have had spontaneous remission from whatever was causing this. We're still perplexed as to what exactly it was, and we want you to undergo more tests and go to Hopkins and do all that follow-up, but your spontaneous remission from the liver and the lungs and the kidneys. Liver is now closing in on the optimal range. The optimal range, per my understanding, unless it's shifted in recent medical times, because they do constantly shift things, the optimal range is about 20-ish to 45. Within 3 weeks of my discharge, which was a few days before Christmas, I was actually in the optimal range. So the big journey for me and what I now specialize in is assisting persons with the reintegration process, because my after effects were so profound. And because I had to spend the next 7 years learning how to manage them and operate in the world and walk away from everything I was to become who I returned as and step into that power and ultimately fulfill what Spirit had told me on the other side, which was that we were going to come into a time wherein all of these persons who had survived great ordeals would come together as a collective to help a traumatized collective begin to heal and come into the golden age of consciousness. So the first 7 years were incredibly difficult, and I ended up learning that I could use my skill set as a therapist to identify the gaps in care that were occurring in the NDE community. And one thing I noticed when I began going out to NDE events and was struggling with my after effects in this first 7 years was that nobody was talking about the difficulties of the after effects, the difficulties of reintegration. They were glossing over the fact that 7% of people that return, adults, would commit suicide. There's one researcher, PMH Atwater, who was acknowledging it. But even when she acknowledged it, nobody went anywhere with it. And then she added to that 21% of children experiencers would complete suicide. And when I heard those statistics, I was like, this is what I need to do. This is who I'm here to help. I've been on this brink my entire life. My NDE showed me there's no judgment. There's unconditional love. These are now my tribe. I have to speak up for them. And the only way I can do it is if I don't just focus on the love and light and beauty of the other side. Yes, that's so important. And that's what almost every NDE story will focus on. For good reason. People need that hope. They need to know that we're beloved beyond all measure and that there is no judgment and that we literally have the light of God within us. Yet at the same time, it's very hard to be a human. And you don't need to be an experiencer or a trauma survivor to have a hard time being here. And so if I was able to start using the art of storytelling, the most ancient medicine there is, to begin to share how I, endured and then struggled and then ultimately overcome this reintegration process, I knew there were other people out there like me. And it was hard because nobody wanted me talking about the shadow side of the NDE. Everybody wanted to focus on the love and the light and all the beauty. And there's so much. I understand that. But at the same time, to me, in transpersonal psychology, we have a term called spiritual bypassing. And that's where you kind of walk the talk and you look the look and you talk about all the good stuff, but positive vibes only. Don't bring in any of that human stuff, or we're all one till you disagree with us, and I was just like, I'm not doing that. I can honor my NDE and all of the gifts of it. Yet at the same time, I can say it is hard and yet holy to be a human. And all of those of us that have returned have gone through periods of reintegration. Some just aren't comfortable talking about them. Well, guess what? I've been through a hell of a lot worse. I can talk about this. And not only that, I'm going to seek out the people that need someone to be their advocate. And then I get to be advocate for trauma survivors because most of the persons I was quickly learning that were struggling to reintegrate were trauma survivors. So I started to look at the literature and I realized there's no literature on NDEs and trauma survivors. There's literature on NDEs, like hellish NDEs, ones that aren't happy. There's literature on, briefly, the suicidality. But there's a gap in care regarding what happens to an individual who's been dissociating or going out of their body their entire life. And suddenly they come back with the gift to go right out the crown chakra. Well, of course it's going to be difficult for those people to embody and to reintegrate because it's way more fun up here. But it's also really hard to be on the ground and be a human and complete your mission and be of service. And so through the grace of Spirit and my angelic teachers, and just my stubborn human will, I began to learn techniques, create techniques, find mentors, and find ways to ground and embody it for myself. I left clinical psychology. I realized that I was never going to fully align with it, and to base my whole identity on something I didn't want to be, and it just didn't fit. And so that was really hard for me as a human. But then I realized I was at the candidacy stage and I didn't finish the dissertation consciously, yet they couldn't take away the knowledge. And I could pair that knowledge with the spiritual knowledge that the other side had given me and continues to give me in abundance. And by doing that, I could create something new that would be of service to the collective, to my community of experiencers, and also my community of trauma survivors. And so really, that's the gift of my NDE, and that's what I'm doing today. For those that have had someone pass on or are in the early stages of bereavement as they accept that a beloved is about to transition, the message I have for them is that it is entirely okay to be human, to grieve, to break down, to fall apart. Those are all valid experiences and are beloved by our Creator. Yet when our beloveds do cross that rainbow bridge of light, they are held in the most beautiful way, and they are loved unconditionally, and you will, in some form or another, be with them again. And knowing they're at peace, especially if it's someone who's gone through a long illness or it's a sudden loss or anything of that, the peace factor, just knowing that they're at peace, can bring you great comfort. For me, it's not a belief that they're in peace. It's a knowing, because I've experienced it myself. I've witnessed my own beloved's transition since. I've had shared death experiences with grandparents. And for example, my grandmother, who had Alzheimer's for 12 years, and she basically forgot us 10 years of that journey. She didn't know who we were the better part of the time. And my grandfather, who had been with her for 60 some years, had such a hard time. And when she was finally ready to go, I managed to get home that day, and we sat with her bedside from 7 in the morning till 7 p.m. I saw the pillar of light. I saw the angelics come in. I could see she wanted to go. And yet she loved my grandfather so much, and he was holding on so hard that she wouldn't leave. And eventually my team said, do the hard thing. And I asked my grandfather if he could go take a walk. And then I walked up to her and I held her hand and I said, it's okay. You can go now. And she didn't respond, like her human vessel just held on to me, but her soul body lit up, and I saw my grandmother the way that I knew her. Like I saw that part of her leave, but she was held in the light of her family. And I've never met her family from Italy, but I could feel their energy, and I knew, that she was surrounded by her beloveds, and she went into that light. And of course my grandfather comes back into the room, and he's heartbroken and he's enraged. He's a little bit mad at me because I told him to go take a walk. Okay, I can hold all that. That's my job. I hold big feelings for a living. And especially for those I love, I can hold them even more. And so it was a bittersweet moment because I was so happy for my grandmother. Like I'm always happy. Like when someone has been suffering, and this is common with NDEers, we don't react to death the same way. So because we know you're going home, like you're going back to the best place ever. And yet that's a very, hard thing. You have to kind of keep that in and anchor it in, because to the humans that are grieving, that hurts. So I managed to keep my own joy for her transition internally, and thank Spirit for that. And then hold space for the grief. And I was grieving too, in the sense that she had left us and she was such an integral part, but it was a split, because there's grief because yes, she's gone, and what's going to become of the family and my grandfather, etc., etc. But at the same time, there was extraordinary peace, knowing she was no longer suffering. She was no longer trapped in a body that wasn't working. So for your highest and best, just hold yourself like the creator does as someone's going. Feel all the emotions. Don't shame yourself. Don't judge yourself. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to go through all of the stages of grief. Yet at the same time, emotions, energy, it coexists. You can be angry, you can be sad, you can grieve for as long as it takes. You can ride those waves, and yet you can trust that there is a force so benevolent, there are no words for it. And that force is part of who your beloved was and is, and that's where they've returned. And there is peace in knowing that. I don't know that I can scientifically or empirically prove the NDE to any skeptic, although there is tons of science now from, persons that have really done empirical research to show that it's true that some experiencers recall what happens in the room. And there's a famous study where they move things in the room, and they then interview NDE years after and see who's able to say, hey, there was a red dot that kept moving around the ceiling. So there's tons of research on that. In fact, there's so much research now to prove that consciousness exists beyond death. It's almost a mute discussion. So anybody that wants to look at the science can look at that. But to a skeptic that's unwilling to just look at the science, my greatest proof as an individual is in the work that I do, because I do occasionally get skeptics. They're some of my favorite clients. And so I tell them, I work in the quantum field. I'm working with the angelics. I do all my sessions by distance, and my clients are in 33 different countries. So I'm using the hands of light and the angelic vibrational medicine I was taught from my guides. And I'm working on people in Australia, New Zealand, Italy, Nova Scotia, wherever they may be, and they are able to feel it. And some have extraordinary shifts. And I always, especially with the skeptics, I always say, how was that? Because I do 60 minutes of the vibrational medicine, working with spirit and then following their lead as to how to help the person clear their energetic field. And then I do 60 minutes of multidisciplinary psychology where we integrate that so they can actually take it out into the world and do things with it. And then I give homeworks to keep them clear and going on their own path towards self-healing. What's fascinating is the skeptics who often tell me I'm not going to feel anything over here in Australia or wherever. They're the first ones to be like, oh, I felt this tingling, and then, all of a sudden I was like, yeah, you jumped on the 30th minute. I'm like, you moved your body. I'm like, why did you jump? Because I asked them sometimes, my instruction is to lie down because it's easier to receive, and I can see the chakras best when they're flat. But occasionally someone gets uncomfortable in the move, and I mark it in my notebook. Jumped, moved, sat up at yada yada time. And when I can tell them something like that, when we haven't been in the physical space together, their minds are just blown wide open. So it's not that I can prove the near-death experience to any doubter. Anyone can say anything they want. They can say it's a dream, whatever. I know it wasn't. I know that what I've been gifted since, how much I struggled with it, with my own doubt, Spirit has time and time and time again proven to me that this is real. I still struggle when I go into sessions. I have to clear myself because my analytical mind will come in and be like, are you just making this up? Sometimes. But then Spirit comes in and it's just, I do my rituals to open the space, and then I'm working with them and I meditate deeply before my sessions. And Spirit's always like, just listen to us, just trust us, follow us, and no session's the same. And sometimes they give me information that makes zero sense to me as a human. I typically get about 12 to 14 pages of information from them as I'm doing the quantum field work, and I'm jotting it down as I'm doing the work. And when I get to interact with the person for the integration portion, it's phenomenal because Spirit might have told me to ask them about a cow in Idaho. What does that mean to me? Absolutely nothing. Yet to that person, I'll mention this, and then they're like sobbing and like they have this massive release because it was something super significant to a shift within their life. So for the doubters, I say, try the work with people that have been given the gifts after the NDE, because that proof is tangible. You can experience that here. But truthfully, you can experience the other side here too. If you choose, you don't have to be an experiencer. You can choose to learn meditation, deep techniques, shamanic journeying, where you get to break through the veil a little bit. You get to taste the divine a little bit here. And I think the more and more that people continue to explore the Eastern traditions, the wisdom traditions, which were so oriented towards that, they were all about anchoring us into that, and still are, that the more people are going to say this is not a byproduct of the brain dying. My brain was technically dead according to medical science, and yet here I am. I was also predicted not to be able to talk or recover. Interestingly, I was also told that 1% survival chance. In December of this year, which was the 10-year anniversary of my coma, I received a letter from Hopkins saying, "Congratulations, we found you a liver." Now, I call them and I'm a bit confused because I get this by mail, not a phone call. You think a liver, like you're gonna get a phone call. This is kind of important, guys. And they send me a letter and they ask me to call immediately and they want to start everything, and I call and it's a Saturday and they don't even answer their phone on Saturdays. Transplant team, this is pretty critical stuff. You'd think they would, but that said, they did not. And so I finally call on Monday and I'm like, "You guys got me a liver? I'm a little perplexed here. I've had spontaneous remission, aka only one doctor was willing to call it a miracle. Many others have since, yet initially they were hesitant to use that word. And then they say to me, well, you were in spontaneous remission, but it was documented it was a 1% chance it would last, so you've been kept on the list. You should take this liver. You still have a 1% chance of survival. I'm like, I have 0 symptoms. I've been in full spontaneous remission. That liver is going to someone that needs it. Please, humbly and in gratitude, take me off that list. And so they did. When I was in the NDE experience, all the communication from the guides and source or God or spirit, or whatever vernacular you want to choose, came through inner knowing and light communication. So the light would change like its pulsation and I would understand what that meant. Very similar to how my eye became the first way that I communicated, was just through this pulsation, and then also inner knowing. So it was a combination of telepathy and inner knowing. It's like you'd think or feel into a question and then you'd receive an answer. And so there was no actual talking. I never heard any voices or anything of that. And one thing I do want to acknowledge that I haven't mentioned is those lights that were so enchanting, the indigo and the green. It wasn't until 3 years after my coma and then another 7 years after my coma when I realized what those lights were, when I gave birth to my 2 sons. And typically you do not see auras on very young children because they're being defined. But when my eldest was put into my arms, I was like just bawling because there was that indigo light just shining from him so brightly. And the beauty of him having an indigo light is he is a naturally born intuitive. He has my gifts. I believe they're a bit heightened because of my own proclivities. And so it's just been so fascinating because as a child I was so isolated and alone in my own experience of that. And now I have a child who in many ways is a teacher and is so excited, and he'll often say to me, "I'm so glad that when we were in that space you chose me." NDEs have different presentations or ways that they express themselves that, in my humble opinion, are in alignment with the truth of the individual. Being a recovering Catholic and an agnostic when I went into my NDE, had Jesus appeared, I probably would have woke up and been like, that was a bad dream. Because it's not a language I spoke or would receive easily. Obviously that shifted as we have Mother Mary right here to our right. That said, everybody's so different. For me, it was very safe and very fitting to have something that looked like the cosmos and felt like the cosmos because I understood science. And so that was a language I could receive. Other people are devoutly religious, and so it's very normative and very comforting for them to be met by deities. So I believe that the NDE accounts, they share some archetypal similarities, the divine love, the non-judgment, the being shown aspects of your human incarnation. But at the same time, the way that it's presented, and what I love about how the NDE research and stories are expanding right now, is we're hearing so much more than the white light. You know, in the beginning, it was all the tunnel, the white light, but those were cardiac arrest patients that were being studied. And that's a very quick flat line and back. Now we're having persons like myself who were gone for 3.5 days. That's a considerable difference in what you're going to experience versus someone who might have just been under for, 20, 30 minutes or 5 minutes or an hour or, gone for that. So I do believe that the archetypal themes are consistent within NDEs. It's just how they express themselves are a reflection of the individual.